Hi everyone, you're all very welcome to this afternoon's lecture, The History and Present Legacy of Magdalen Institutions in Ireland by Professor Katherine O'Donnell. My name is Melissa Boyle and I'm the Director of Rarim South Dublin Arts Centre and the Curator of the Magdalene Series. This afternoon's event is part of a wider programme marking International Women's Day and also the closing of the map, a collaboration by Rachel Fallon and Alice Maher. And We Are the Map, a collaboration by Sinead Gleeson and Stephen Shannon. It's the second exhibition in the Michelin Series at Rarim. Just to give you some context, just in case anybody isn't aware of what the Michelin Series is, it's a programme of exhibitions, interventions, performances, and events in response to the figure of Mary Magdalene. The commissioning process for the series started back in 2018 with an invitation to artists that I knew would create really significant and interrogative work in response to the conflicted and mysterious figure of Mary Magdalene. The artists are Amanda Coogan, Rachel Fallon, Alice Maher, Jessie Jones, and Grace Diaz, some of whom are joining us this afternoon. So as part of our wider education, engagement and research programme at Rarim, we create new ways for people to access contemporary art through inviting a wide range of people to interact with the subject matter and themes within the exhibition. I was first introduced to Katherine O'Donnell at UCD School of Architecture in March 2020. I think it was about 5 days, maybe not even 5 days before the first lockdown happened. When I went to visit the students' work that had been created as part of the Open Heart Studio at Sean McDermott Street, and such a fascinating and wonderful project. And since then, Katherine and her colleagues and collaborators, Maeve O'Rourke, Mark Cohen, and others with the Magdalen artists, they joined us as part of the research programme. And really, like, their invaluable experience and knowledge and history of the laundries in Ireland and the Justice for Magdalenes research has made a massive impact into the Magdalene Series collaboration and the work that each of the artists has produced for it. And so it was for all of these reasons that we felt that it was really vital that Katherine was invited to be part of this programme for this week. So Katherine, you're very welcome. And before I hand over to you, I'll just do a quick bio. So Professor Katherine O'Donnell, History of Ideas, UCD School of Philosophy, is a member of the Justice for Magdalenes Research. She has published widely in Irish cultural history. As a member of Justice for Magdalenes Research, she has received a number of activist honours, including the Labour Party's Thirst for Justice and Dublin Lord Mayor's Award. She was also awarded a number of honours for her teaching, including the UCD President's Gold Medal and British University's Learning On-Screen Award for her work with TrueTube to create learning and teaching materials for GCSE students. Her most recent publications include Irish Magdalenes, A Campaign for Justice, co-written with her Justice for Magdalenes research colleagues, Claire McKittrick, Maeve O'Rourke, James Smith, and Maurice Steed. So as well, just before I hand you over, just a wee bit of format for this afternoon's event. Although I can't see any of you, which is a real pity, and I can't hear you, we would really love to hear your questions. So please, throughout the talk, if you can type your questions into the Q&A function at any time, we will keep them until the end, and then I will read them and direct them to Katherine after she has spoken. So Katherine will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes. There's no limit really on this either, Katherine. And then we'll take questions for a further 15 minutes. So thank you so much, Katherine. It's just really, it's brilliant to have you as part of our programme for this week. Over to you.
Hello, everybody who I can't see. Let's share my screen so that you can see. I'll do it from the beginning now. Play from the start. Okay, so you can see my screen and you can see my PowerPoint. I'm going to have a whistle-stop tour through these slides. So hang on to your seats and put in any questions, ideas, comments, thoughts you might have into the chat function, and I'm going to go through it as quickly as I can so that we'll have plenty of time for coming back to points that you might want more information on, or for other kinds of chats. So just to say that I'm a member of Justice for Magdalenes Research. There are 5 of us. We're an activist research group. And at this stage, I think we're also family. So I promised to talk about the history of the Magdalen institutions, and my title in UCD School of Philosophy is History of Ideas. So I want to talk about what I think are significant ideas, a mentality that came together from the early 19th century that led into the architecture of containment, to quote Jim Smith, that we saw in a pervasive way right throughout 20th century Ireland. So what we see in the relatively early decades of the 19th century is a post-Catholic emancipation. So we can talk about what the penal laws were and what Catholic emancipation was, if you like. I'm just going to take it as read that most people here know what that is. And we begin to see a rise in Catholic religious orders being indigenous, being founded in Ireland, and kind of answering the appeal of both Catholic emancipation and repealing the Act of Union with Britain. This really becomes kind of super turbocharged in the post-famine era. But even in the early decades of the 19th century, we see the kind of formation of this national movement, which is around announcing a belief that the Irish could govern themselves, or at least have devolved powers from the British Empire, and understanding that a kind of a new Catholic religious movement post-1829 is a vehicle for this announcing of a Victorian capacity to self-govern. So we see that there's a massive building boom in Catholic churches, even before the famine, when Ireland was still very much a poor country. There was 2,000 Catholic churches built. After the famine, which is absolutely devastating for Ireland and still has a massive effect, we're the only country in Europe that has a lower population in the 21st century than we had in the 19th century. So the famine was brutal. It wiped out the lower class, the people who lived in the 4th class cabins, and 1 million died and 1 million more poor people emigrated. But what you see from after the decades after the famine of the late 1840s is a very visible rise of a Catholic middle class, particularly from the 1860s. So historians call this the Irish Catholic embourgeoisement. And we see this kind of symbiotic interdependency where Catholic middle class people go in to lead the orders, and there's a dowry system for nuns where you needed a middle class dowry to become a choir sister, but if you were working class, you could come in as a lay sister and not take full ordination, not be fully consecrated as a choir sister. So what we see in this period is an expansion of the reach of educational health welfare services offered by Catholic religious orders. And this is understood as kind of overcoming the defeats of the Reformation and even the defeats of the British colonization of Ireland. What we also get at this time, which remarkably hasn't been very well documented, is a rise in what we might call, or what is called, scientific racism. So again, I can talk about this all day. I'm kind of very immersed in this research at the moment. I'm finding it very, very fascinating, the amount of scientific research done, particularly on the Irish poor and working class, which basically proved that the Irish poor and working class were Africanoid. So they had very high indices of what was called nigricence, which proved that they were a lower hierarchical race, entirely different race to the Anglos, that they were quite simian, monkey-like. They'd come from Africa, obviously. And this scientific racism, I think, is a very important dynamic for understanding the mentality of the rising new Catholic middle class in Ireland, and indeed they're, in fact, able for home rule. Here we see an image of, from 1869, of Cardinal Paul Cullen, the first Irish cardinal, who is shown to be arguing, like keeping the Catholic children away from a national school because he wanted a denominational education, and he did get his way. We also see a very kind of typical cartoon from the 1880s where there was imperial anxieties around land agitation, land wars, and of course Fenians still being a bogeyman for the British Empire. But the imperial fears were manifested in terms of the scientific racism of the day, showing the Irish to be simian, Africanoid, and kind of a lower race, and therefore naturally, scientifically proven to be unworthy of self-governance or home rule. Wherever the Irish went, these are our cartoons from the late 19th century in the United States. The Irish were met with this understanding of the kind of racial profiling of the Irish as not being white, and certainly not being the same race as English or white Britons. And here's some more very interesting late 19th century cartoons on the Irish woman, one from America, the poor middle class woman who is finds it difficult to deal with her Irish Bridget servant, and then another typical racist scientific view of a paragon of English femininity and Irish femininity. So besides this kind of context of scientific racism that I do think kind of formed part of the mindset of the Irish middle class, was something they were trying to work against, but also something that they inhabited. So they really did believe that morality was transmitted through the genes, and that some people inherited characteristics of kind of probity, very Victorian values, imperial values of probity, self-governance, being respectable, and other people inherited through their biology and their family tree propensities to be criminal, to be poor, to be lazy. And I do think that this kind of inheritance from the context in which the Irish middle class were trying to establish themselves as a respectable class that could self-govern is an important legacy that we see continue on into the 20th century. Another major dimension to the formation of the mindset of the Irish middle class is the publications of the Papal Encyclical, 1895, Rarim Novarum, from Pope Leo XIII. It's an incredible document that laid out Catholic social doctrine, and it has been repeated on various kind of significant anniversaries of the publication, right through to the current papacy. It tries to chart a middle ground between fears of the Catholic Church around unrestricted capitalism, which is good, in my book. And then it also, the other kind of bogeyman, the pole that it's trying to navigate between is socialism, and is it the idea of a strong state that will provide welfare, health services, and education. So the Pope argued that actually it was against natural law for a state to provide services that voluntary organizations could deliver for themselves. So he argued in what has been called by Catholic theologians and social policy people ever since the principle of subsidiarity, or in other words, government should not take on the jobs of what lesser and subordinate voluntary organizations can do. And guess what? Of course, these are going to be Catholic organizations. Merely regulate and even lightly regulate the subsidiary organizations. So it's been affirmed continually since, and I think we're living with this legacy in a major way in Ireland. And I'll just make a little nod there to the new National Maternity Hospital, and we're still not actually clear if the Religious Sisters of Charity are actually going to be owners of this hospital, and indeed in control of the governing body, or that the governing body would be under the ethos of the Religious Sisters of Charity. So to take us back to 1901 and the kind of major campaign for home rule, just to give a little nod there to the MP, Edmund Leamy, who was one of many Irish nationalist home rulers who spoke
Catherine,
in 1901 and again in 1911.
Catherine, I'm actually
Can you hear me?
stop you. I can. I'm just going to stop you because I'm going to take over and share the slides on your behalf, just because you're breaking up a little bit, and I think it will help to ease the bandwidth on your end, if that's okay. So I'm just going to share my screen with your slides just to make sure we don't lose you.
Sure, and will I stop the share?
Yeah, I'll stop your share here and I'll just share the screen here. 1 second.
I can also switch my, okay.
You can see that there, okay, Catherine?
Perfectly, yep.
And if you just want to indicate to me then when you're ready by saying, please, next slide, and I'll move them on.
Okay, so we can see with Edmund Leamy here that there is a kind of a remarkable declaration. There was hardly one of the nationalist members who had not a relative of none. And he's arguing really, really strongly against any kind of state regulation of all of the laundries, the industrial schools, reformatory school factories that were run by religious orders. So the British state was trying to bring in regulations whereby Magdalen laundries, industrial school factories would come under the Factories Act. And the Irish nationalists fought incredibly hard and eventually successfully to get derogations for Catholic religious orders. So next slide, please. What I would argue is what we ended up with from kind of 1912 and in 1922, when there was limited amounts of independence for the 26 counties in the south, who became the Free State, that you still have this mindset of what scholars, particularly African scholars and Latin American scholars, would call coloniality. So we still, I would argue, had long-standing kind of patterns of power that result from colonialization, and that define the ideas of what is culture, what is labor, and how we relate intersubjectively to each other. So to quote Walter de Melillo, independence changed the actors but not the script. And it's not just that this happened in Ireland. We can see this happening in other places whereby countries get released from imperial colonial control. And next slide, please. So what do I mean then by the mentality continued? Well, part of what continued was that middle-class Catholics continued to anxiously prove that they were the power that could govern and should govern. And we continue to see what Edmund Leamy had pointed out, the MP Edmund Leamy, that nationalist established leaders had extremely strong relationships with religious orders, and particularly with nuns who ran religious orders. Next slide, please. We see this mentality, this coloniality, in how the established Irish middle class, or this is my argument, thought of the Irish poor and the Irish poor working class. So they were still kind of anxious about those people, as if those people who were in the so-called lower classes were actually not the same race or ethnicity almost as the middle class rulers. Harry Ferguson describes the mentality of institutional care throughout 20th century Ireland as demanding that unless poor and working class children were reformed in industrial schools and reformatory schools, unless they were molded by these institutions, they were considered a moral dirt, a contagion, and a real significant threat to the social order. Lindsay Erner Byrne has analysed all debates, revealing a contemporary welfare debates reveal a deep-rooted distrust of the working class family, and also that in the same manner as the scientific races, poverty is often conflated with criminality, and the poor are regarded as kind of culpable. Those people are like that. Carol Houlihan has done an amazing job in a report published by Amnesty International, where she found systematic, long-established negative attitudes towards poverty, depriving poor and working class children of their rights, which were afforded to middle-class counterparts. And next slide. So what we got in Ireland throughout the 20th century was what scholars such as Ona Sullivan and Ian O'Donnell have called coercive confinement, a culture of coercive confinement. And we managed to lock up 1% of the Irish population in a whole network of institutions, industrial reformatory schools, Magdalen laundries, of course, psychiatric hospitals, mother and baby homes, county homes. 1% of the population is an enormous amount. We beat Stalinist Russia in the 20th century for the amount of people who were supposedly our own people, unless we thought of them as a different kind. Those people were locked up. There was, of course, gender, class, ethnic, very anti-traveller and disability policing. And next slide, please. After 1922, there were 10 Magdalen institutions found in the 26 counties. They were operated by 4 religious orders. And these orders also managed other state residential institutions, particularly for children. And next slide, please. So what were the conditions like for the women in the Magdalenes? We know that on arriving into the institution, they were given a name and number. Their hair, if they had it long, was shorn, and they generally did have it long. They were put into uniforms, and sometimes very antiquated uniforms. They were locked in. Escapees were returned by the police. They were put to hard labor, doing commercial laundry, and also needlework, such as the famous Limerick lace of the Limerick Magdalene, the smocking done by the Good Shepherds in Cork, embroidery. Their accommodation was incredibly poor. Their hygiene was also poor food. A system of prayer, silence, hard work. There were punishments for anybody who refused it to work. There was little or no contact with the outside world, and if anybody did manage to come to visit, those visits were heavily monitored, as were letters. Research done by my colleague Claire McGettrick is currently pointing to the fact that it seems that 50% of the women who were incarcerated in the Magdalenes just remained there to live, work, and ultimately die behind those walls. Next slide, please. Voices begin to be heard in the early 90s, even before the last Magdalen closed, which was in Sean McDermott Street in 1996. 1992 saw the close of the Donnybrook Magdalen, for example. And it is kind of quite significant that it's female voices that kind of lead the way in terms of opening up awareness of how brutal and terrifying these systems were. Next slide, please. Our campaign became established in 2003, but didn't really take off until 2009. The founders of the JFM campaign were Mary Steed, who's kind of at the bottom end of that photograph, and next to her with the blonde hair is Claire McGettrick. The two of them were adoption rights activists. 2009, James Smith joined the campaign, and he recruited me and Maeve O'Rourke, who at the time was studying for a master's in human rights law in Harvard. So our work was archival. The nuns still won't release any of their records and are under no compunction to do so by the state. But we went into state archives and diocesan archives to the extent that we were allowed. And we found a huge amount of evidence of how the Irish state had knowingly conspired with the Magdalen institutions across the 20th century. And when I say knowingly, they knew that women were locked in, they knew that there was no wages being paid, but still they gave contracts and sent girls and women in there. We began gathering oral histories and testimonies, so we've over 100 gathered now. The Names Project is Claire's project, where she is trying to, by a very, very creative use of archives, and I can talk about that later, including electoral rolls, she's trying to find out who died there and ensure that the graves that are unmarked are properly acknowledged and marked. We began a media and public education campaign. We started to make legal arguments, largely via Maeve, that showed how the Irish state had broken domestic law, Irish constitutional law, as well as international human rights treaties in the kinds of supports that they gave the Magdalen institutions. And we took those arguments first to various human rights fora, and the first one we took it to was the Committee Against Torture. Okay, next slide. We worked hard to develop a 4-part scheme of what redress would look like that included an apology and why an apology and how an apology should be made, various forms of redress, which I can talk about, a compensation by a separate tribunal, and what we called transitional justice measures. And I can talk about that in more detail later. The next slide, thanks. We submitted to what was called the Macaleese Commission, because he chaired this interdepartmental committee that was to investigate state involvement in the Magdalene Research. We gave a 145-page document showing evidence of state complicity, which was supported by nearly 800 pages of survivor testimony. And at the back there is the nearly 4,000 pages of supporting evidence. Next slide. The Interdepartmental Committee report, it did not investigate allegations of torture. It was not actually truth-finding. There was no public call for testimony. It absolutely, utterly and completely ignored the testimony we submitted. It didn't portray the experience of the women. It not merely allowed the nuns to contribute to the report, it actually kind of ran drafts by them, and their own written critique was accepted as bona fide fact. Next slide, please. It failed to report on all the records we actually gave them. It was utterly and completely and egregiously misleading, let us just say, in its account of duration of stay of women. It completely failed to adequately investigate the deaths of women in custody in the Magdalenes. And then it performed this kind of stepping outside its remit because, you know, there was some public questions to be answered. So it went outside the statutory limits of its investigation, and it just merely asserted that the nuns made no profit, and they got accountants of the nuns to write letters saying no profit was declared. And then it just said no physical abuse took place. No physical abuse took place, even though these girls and women were locked in. I mean, the IDC report itself admitted that girls as young as 9 were put into Magdalene institutions, locked in, forced to hard labor, punished if you didn't work, returned by the Gardaí, and somehow that's not physical abuse. But anyway, let's move on, please. It also, of course, ignored actual scars and punishment that did take place. So none of our testimony appeared in the final report, not a word. Next slide, please. and how they described this particular photograph within the report is nearly laughable. But anyway, survivors and witnesses who gave their testimony via JFM offered accounts of physical and other forms of abuse in the Magdalen laundries. Again, was utterly dismissed. So there was no apology on the day that Senator McAleese dropped the report, and he immediately retired from public life on the same day. So there was nobody to answer to the report. Opposition TDs, while we waited for 2 weeks before the Dáil was going to come and address the issue of the Magdalenes again, we got opposition TDs to read the testimony we had gathered into the Dáil record, and they concluded the reading with the declaration, "I believe the women." Thank you. We get an apology 2 weeks later. Thank you. In May 2013, we get Justice John Quirke appointed to design the Magdalen Restorative Justice Scheme. We reform, announcing the end of our campaign, and JFM Research is founded. The redress scheme that Justice Quirke came out with actually mirrored almost all parts of what we had suggested, except a compensation tribunal. So we were pleased with his recommendation and pleased that the government said that they would implement exactly what he had said should be done for the Magdalenes in terms of restorative justice. But very quickly we realized that the Department of Justice were putting their intellects and their expertise into frustrating what Justice Quirke had recommended. Eventually we get an ombudsman's report on the Magdalen Restorative Justice Scheme, and indeed there's some YouTube video of him very close to tears when he's before a Dáil committee, speaking about how what the Department of Justice had done was to maladminister the scheme in a manifestly unfair fashion. He considered that the department's objections to his report to be disingenuous in the extreme, an example of departmental stonewalling. So they wouldn't even deal with him when he was trying to write his report on how the scheme was being implemented and managed. And again, we could speak more about that later. Next slide, please. So the ongoing work we have, this is a nice picture from Dublin Honours Magdalenes, which was something that we organised. Was supposed to be part of the redress scheme, but the Department of Justice hadn't done it. So we got the minister at the time, Charlie Flanagan, to sponsor it, and we used the wonderful services of Nora Casey, the businesswoman, to have this event. So we continue to support survivors through this maladministered scheme in their appeals on kind of the awards that they're given. We continue, specifically Maeve, to take legal cases to UN bodies and European Court of Justice. Maeve and Claire together have operated the Clan Project, which was about feeding into and writing a report for the Mother and Baby Home Commission, and responding to that Commission's report, and continuing to respond to and try and influence policy around what we call Ireland's forced family separation scheme, which is the closed secret adoption regime we've had in 20th century Ireland. Melissa has already mentioned the Sean McDermott Street project that I've been involved in, which is working with the School of Architecture in UCD and Queen's University Belfast to imagine work in public consultation and work with our students and work with the amazing group known as Collab Architects, who have designed a vision document for how that large site in our inner city could be redeveloped. Including a museum of unheard and untold stories and a waiting archive that would see at last the final release of all of the archive that the state is currently sitting on and refusing to release. That is the over 2 million pieces of paper collected by the Commission to Inquire into Child Abuse. That's the Ryan Commission. The huge archive that's currently in the Department of Taoiseach that was generated by the Magdalen inquiry. And of course, the enormous amount of archive gathered with the most recent inquiry into the mother and baby home. So we would wish to see an archive that would hold this material, sensitively redact, but most importantly, release it to the people who are directly affected, who can't get their own personal information and files. We continue to write on academic publications, to produce educational resources, particularly for second level. That's kind of a project we're going to be working with New Decade filmmakers over the summer. And we've been developing a network of Irish studies and transitional justice. So getting people together to think about how we might think of the pillars of transitional justice as a way to guide us into imagining and designing, if you like, what needs to happen for a more equitable 21st century. Next slide, please. So the Irish state continues to ensure secrecy. The Commission of Investigation Act ensures that all archives remain sealed. So that's why we're arguing for this waiting archive in the site of Sean McDermott Street. And if you want to kind of look at that particular vision document, the website to go to is the Open Heart City website. And that's a collective of largely academics and architects who have come together to specifically work on how we can imagine the spatial reconfiguration of that last Magdalen laundry. Okay, next slide, please. There are legacies of trauma among the surviving women, and indeed the large population that was held in related institutions, such as industrial schools, mother and baby homes, etc. So the legacies include people who have to deal with a lack of self-trust and low self-regard, depression, anxiety, addiction issues to kind of as coping mechanisms, a lack of education, which of course can mean poorly paid or indeed no work, and then legacy issues if they marry and have children into the next generation. Next slide. But having said all of that, I mean, the survivors too are among the most amazing people I've ever met. Because faced with those challenges of what happened to them in their childhood, teenage years, early 20s, they have learned remarkable lessons in not merely surviving, but even thriving. One of the ways in which is very clear to me, from having collected so many oral histories they've managed to survive, is that they find other people to love, are animals. There's more animal rescuers among the Magdalen survivors than I've ever kind of come across in Irish culture and society. They advocate for other mothers in crisis and children as well. And they're two of my favorites in front of the doll. Next slide, please. So we're continuing to, as academics, to think about Ireland's kind of neo-colonial Ireland and how transitional justice, which has four main thematic planks of truth-telling, accountability, redress and reparation for trauma, and guarantees of non-recurrence. What would that look like if we try and translate them into an Irish polity, Irish society, Irish culture? And we've started to kind of gather other academics who work in the broad area of Irish studies and academics who wouldn't generally have worked in Irish studies, such as accountants, architects, archaeologists, that's just the A's, to come together and kind of reimagine their work as justice work. Next slide, please. So yes, that's another slide on transitional justice and restorative justice and how we imagine that kind of rolling out in terms of principles that guide us throughout our academic work going forward. And next slide, please. the end. Here's again that interesting photograph of the Gardaí marshalling women from Sean McDermott Street, Magdalen, who are released to walk in the Corpus Christi procession in 1965. You can get further information from our website and from our archival repository. And next slide. There's the Clan project I mentioned. I should have put up another slide, which I don't have, on the Open Heart City project. And final slide, I think, is 2 publications. So last September, myself and my Justice for Magdalenes Research colleagues co-wrote a book, Ireland and the Magdalen Laundries, a campaign for justice. I hope you can find it in your local library. And in about 2 months' time, we're coming out with an edited collection of essays that is part of this kind of transitional justice project, looking back at Ireland's institutions and looking at them through the lens of transitional justice. It's called Redress, with an amazing front cover using the artwork of Alison Lowry, currently on permanent display now in the National Museum. Okay, guys, that's me over and done.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I feel quite emotional after that, and angry, really, really angry. That was an amazing talk right from the start. It makes me so angry whenever I think of the various reports that have been written about other injustices as well, you know, that we should have learned from, you know, like the Widgery report on Bloody Sunday being one of my mind. And then, you know, the Magdalenes report, it just makes me livid. I think it's really vital what you are doing in terms of it being part of the curriculum now, because whenever we were growing up, we didn't question this. It wasn't really talked about, it wasn't known. And indeed, like I've spoken to you this before, it wasn't until I moved to Dublin in 1992 and slowly realised that there were Magdalen laundries operating in Dublin at that time. And that's whenever I started getting interested in it, and I was horrified, really, really horrified, but it wasn't part of my learning at all. And yet it was known by many, you know, at that time. So thank you so much for kind of pushing that towards, you know, it should be studied in the national curriculum. So I think it's brilliant what you're doing with New Decade, and well done. Hopefully we have some questions here. Yeah, we have some questions. I'm just going to read them out here. Okay. So we have first question from Shreya. What do you think are the challenges for women these days, and what can be done about them?
Well, I'm interested to hear what you think they are, Shreya. I suppose poverty is always an issue for women because we are unfairly burdened by poverty, and also if we've children, they're born into, you know, the chances of, if we're poor, they're going to be very poor. And I do see it as a major feminist issue. And allied with poverty, I would see, speaking as somebody who's kind of interested in mentality and kind of the ideas, the ideology that fuel the kind of the norms and rules, those unspoken assumptions about how we deal and relate to each other. I would say the politics of respectability, who's respectable and who's disrespectable, that's absolutely a woman's issue. The guys don't have to deal with that in the ways that female people do. And yeah, so the politics of respectability, who gets respected and who gets to speak and who gets seen as credible and who gets seen as authoritative and who gets seen as worthy of care and attention, that's absolutely a massive challenge for all of us, including those of us who get this conferred dominance, this kind of unearned advantage, where we're automatically by virtue largely of our class, for example, taken seriously, encouraged to take ourselves seriously, and are automatically have this social capital of respectability. I think it's incumbent on people like me who kind of have that social capital to find ways to disaffiliate from it, or to share it, or to challenge that mentality, that kind of idea. That would be my off the top of the head answer to you.
Thank you. We have a question from Grace Diaz. Thank you for an excellent talk, Katherine, as always. In your time spent with survivors, I'm wondering what their feelings about Mary Magdalene as a figure, a saint, etc. Something that comes through my work in the series is Mary Magdalene is sorry for everything that was done in her name.
Mm. Brilliant, Grace. Yeah, there's a book it's just out, I think, by a woman called Chloe Gott, G-O-T-T, and she's been the first person to look at this kind of archive built up of the Magdalen oral histories, and she's specifically interested in the women's relationship to spirituality and religion. A lot of the women that I spoke with would have a very strong spirituality in that they have a very clear sense of their relationship to a god or to ideas of goodness. And they use that to say that the nuns are godless. So in terms of Mary Magdalene, I didn't really hear them much kind of identify with Mary Magdalene, but that perhaps should have been a question we could have thought to put to them. But they do have, it is, you know, their relationship to organized religion is largely one of massive distrust. But at the same time, I would call them spiritual or even religious women, largely.
Okay, we have a question from Jill Ryan. Thanks, Katherine. That was powerful and horrifying. I'm just wondering how you have experienced the Magdalene series so far and how you feel they have interpreted the legacy of the Magdalene woman.
I love that you ask how I've experienced it so far, because I think, yeah, I'm really looking forward to the ways in which the artist's work is going to continue to percolate through me. It's so unbelievably rich. So I've only just started kind of tasting it, if you like. I think it's amazing, but I think also, you know, I have said this before, that it was artists who've led the way. So yeah, the documentary voices started to come out in the early 90s. But one of the first kind of people who kind of broke this open was the poet and playwright Patricia Burke Brogan. And then we see visual artists as well, who were the first to, such as Melissa and her work on the Derry Magdalenes. This was back in the 90s, you know, and a long, long time before people like me, the academics, or even the kind of, you know, feet on the ground feminist activists were actually able to see what was right in front of us. The artists were able to really, really see it. So I love that about art. I love that they can make connections and see more clearly for all of us. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing. I know there are plans for moving around the art exhibition into other countries. I'm really, really curious to see what the resonance in other countries will be, because, you know, this is a deeply misogynist regime we're talking about, and misogyny, unfortunately, is worldwide. So it'll be fascinating to see what other cultures and countries how they can connect with this work too. I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you. I think we're really excited about the prospect of that as well. Lauren asks, just wondering if the continuation of your work, have you been looking into the current issues of Ireland's maternity hospital being taken over by the Sisters of Charity? So I know that you mentioned that early on in the talk.
Yeah, I'm really kind of proud of the work that I've done around that, in that a student and I released kind of a petition that gained a huge, it's still being the the biggest ever uptake on the Uplift petition platform. And that led to the first major protest march around the NMH and really raised consciousness. And I spoke on the at the end of the rally on that. So I'm proud of kind of being involved in raising that consciousness of it as an issue. And it's funny, when Shreya was asking that question, like, what are the challenges for women these days? One of the things I normally answer, and this is from somebody who's never been pregnant, is reproductive justice doesn't kind of stop with having the kind of limited access to terminating pregnancies that we now have, or the ways in which we can now finally, use contraception. It's around maternity services that are so woefully underfunded in Ireland, causing huge amounts of trauma to people giving birth. I think it's absolutely a national disgrace, or it should be considered a national disgrace. So yes, we need a new national maternity hospital and much, much, much better standards of care. I mean, one of the things that Irish medicine has given the world, unfortunately, is medically managed pregnancies and maternity services. I hope you can still hear me. It says my internet connection is unstable. But anyway, I think that maternity services in Ireland shouldn't be medically led. They should be midwife led. There should be far more resources into that, and the medical system just there when those people who need it for their pregnancies can go back into that service and come back out of it again into a much more woman-centered maternity service. So I am really concerned about the National Maternity Hospital in kind of a broader level, and I think, doesn't it sum up where we are? That we're still not clear around how much control the nuns are going to have. They're obviously going to own it because it's, there's been no compulsory purchase order, and they got permission from the Vatican to set up this new Catholic organization that's going to govern it. So they made sure to do due diligence by the canon law of the Catholic Church, but they're not playing ball at all with the Irish state's law around governance and ownership. And there's also not nearly enough pressure being put on them to actually hand over the land, so we can be sure that it is a secular best possible maternity service given to all.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, we have a few more questions here. We have one from Rachel Fallon. Comment, first of all, absolutely amazing talk, Catherine, thank you. How far do you think we have come in changing the narrative of demonizing the poor?
I think we've come some ways. I mean, when you read Lindsay Erner Burns' work, which I would highly recommend, and her analysis of the Dáil debates, it is very shocking, and I don't think people would get away with what they said now. I mean, for example, the centering on the kind of socialized medicine that Noel Brown was bringing in for mothers and children, and the massive Catholic Church blocking of that because it's socialized medicine. And it should, of course, be under the voluntary subsidiary model of the Catholic Church, not run by the state. The kinds of things that were said during those debates, when some people like James Dillon were actually very strong in speaking up for the poor children in industrial schools, definitely kept calling it out as class bias. But you see arguments being made that the money that was being given to religious orders, and they were paid a lot of money to care for the children of the poor. For example, the average was, according to Mary Raftery's findings, the state paid the Catholic Church per child an average of an unskilled labouring man's wage per week per child. And so there was arguments made, why don't we give that money to the labouring poor, to working class, to those poor families? and it was said, oh, well, we can't be sure that those families would actually care for the children, that they'd squander that money. I really, really, really doubt that those kind of things would be said today. But of course, so I don't think we demonize the poor to the extent that we did in the 50s and 60s and 70s, perhaps. But yeah, I think there's more awareness that poverty is caused by social situation and context rather than something that's inherent into the individual. We still have a politics of the disrespected, though, and the respectable. And I think that's what we have to, a more subtle kind of apparatus, and therefore perhaps more difficult to unpack. I hope that answers that.
Yeah, absolutely. Jessie has said, thanks, Catherine, great talk and this deeply meaningful work. I'm wondering what international connections there are between researchers and activists across Magdalen laundries. I am interested in the events in the Lockburn laundry in Glasgow in the 50s and the escape of the girls and public reception of this in the media at that time. Do you have any other examples of how Magdalenes existed outside of Ireland also?
Yeah, thanks, Jessie. That's really, or Jessica, that's really, really great. So yes, for example, those Westminster Debates from 1901 and 1911, where the Irish nationalists were strongly pushing back against any kind of regulation on factories run by religious orders. Those debates came about because the British parliamentarians were so worried by reports in France from girls who had run away from the Good Shepherd Magdalen laundries and industrial schools there. And of course, the Good Shepherds were main players in Ireland too. And because of that concern and absolutely believing what happened, and also believing there was another, around 1911, I think there was a case where 2 girls ran away from a Catholic convent, again, kind of work camp in Sheffield. I think one of them was seriously injured trying to escape. So they were shut down in France. They were shut down in Britain. They seem to have existed longer in the US. And there's amazing work being done on the history of women's prisons in the US now that is looking back specifically at the Good Shepherd sisters as being the people who provided the first prisons for women. The international dimension is fascinating. We tend to work a lot with people in Canada and Australia who are also dealing with the recent legacy of particularly industrial reformatory schools for Indigenous peoples there. Run by people like the Christian Brothers. So we have an awful lot of kind of points of comparison. And I, it was in talking with them, it really kind of brought it up for me the ways in which the Irish poor were kind of thought of as an ethnicity apart from the middle class. It really brought into relief that what I call a coloniality, or that kind of legacy of a racism. And the people that we're also interested in speaking with too are people who are working on Franco's Spain, and specifically on mother and baby homes there. Again, there seems to be huge points of comparison. So we can definitely learn more from speaking with activists and academics abroad, because it kind of shows up in relief some things that we might miss in terms of thinking through the issue here. We can tend to kind of have a certain view of Irish exceptionalism, whereas actually if you look at Catholic social doctrine and how it plays out in other countries who are following the kind of subsidiarity model, you begin to understand some of the dynamics of what we still have here in the 21st century, but certainly in the 20th century. Thanks.
Brilliant. Alice is asking, well, she said, I'm struck by the use of silence as a weapon, and I think it's something deeply ingrained in Irish society.
Yeah, I don't know if you've read the short novel by Claire, oh my God, I'm just blanking on her name, and I'm blanking on the novel's name. She wrote Foster.
Keegan, Claire Keegan. Yeah.
think that novel really, really, really lays bare the fear behind the silence. So it's set in the 80s, and there's remarkable kind of conversation between the main protagonist, who's barely hanging on to his small business, which is, it's under a lot of economic strain because all his customers are under such economic strain. He delivers coal and fuel. And there's an amazing conversation between him and his wife, where he's quite concerned by having come across a girl who was trying to escape a convent-run laundry in his small town. And his wife is telling him, like, we have children. We can't afford to speak. And there's an amazing aside where the convent sister, who's his best customer and always pays cash and on time, kind of, you know, does that wonderful nun remark where she lets him know that his daughter, who's going to the convent school and is doing really well in the convent school and looks like she'd be actually able to get a white-collar job if she kind of does as well, keeps going in the trajectory she's going. The nun says to him that she saw the daughter in the choir and it looked like she belonged there. So there's this kind of weaponizing of respectability. And I think a lot of the silence in Ireland is around the fear of not even drawing the kind of material catastrophe of being disrespectful on yourself, but actually the family that you're from. You know, if you are if you fall, to use the generic way of describing kind of falling out of favor or falling into sin, your siblings can be affected. The whole kind of, you know, in a country that had very little money, social capital is a huge resource. And I think that's, you know, it's our social cohesion, I think, can actually keep us bound by silence, that we're keeping quiet for others as much as for ourselves. But yeah, I think you're right. I think in looking at the dimensions of Irish silence and what's not said, whatever you say nothing. I think you're going to get in. I think that's a kind of key for unlocking a lot of the dynamics that we know we're involved in, but we haven't quite named how or why yet. But yeah, that little book, that Claire Keegan book, All the Small Things, I think it is.
Yeah, small things like these. Yeah, and I've just read it recently. It's a wonderful book.
Brilliant.
And it reminded me of one of the stories from last night, from Ireland's Dirty Laundry, the New Decade production, of the family who managed to bring out, I think it was 15 women out of the laundry. And it was purely from the mother was working inside the laundry. And they took it upon themselves that this was not right. And so the father, I think it was the father, came and collected 15 of the girls and brought them out to the house. And then the nuns realized that it was an insider's job and she was dismissed. And she came home and she read out the letter to her family, and her two sons were telling this story about how they got out. The father got out a can of Guinness and opened it and they celebrated. And I just thought that was a wonderful moment in terms of that breaking of the silence. But yeah, the Claire Keegan book, I would definitely recommend it.
And as Alice says, people still say fall pregnant. Yeah. But even though that family did that amazing thing, it was still a secret, wasn't it? I mean, it was a secret. So yeah, we interviewed them about 6 years ago. And they'd never actually met any of the women who they had helped facilitate escape. They could never speak about it. Their parents were now dead. So even though they were remarkably brave, it was a secret.
Yeah. We have one more question from Rachel. How do you think the Catholic Church's hold over the schools, in particular the private schools, helped perpetuate the social acquiescence within the country?
Well, I think just speaking for myself, you know, had a lovely experience in the convent school I went to. I mean, they got me when I was young. I still respond to a lot of the aesthetics and the ideas and the ways of, you know, the perspective. And I think I've mentioned before in conversation with some of you that sometimes the work on the Magdalenes for me, and I think Maeve too, even though Maeve's an awful lot younger than me, but I had the Ursulines, she had the Loretto nuns, and sometimes it can feel like we're murdering our own grandmothers, you know, that we're being incredibly ungrateful. But so yeah, I think again, Justice Ryan, there's a very interesting conversation between him and Patsy McGarry in the Irish Times quite recently, and 2019 on the 10th anniversary of his kind of momentous big report on the Commission to Inquire into Child Abuse. He was describing the money that was made, patently made by the Christian Brothers who educated him, and the abuse, the appalling levels of abuse of poor and working class children. And he was saying he was mystified because this was an order that really cherished education. And of course, it had given this guy a leg up so he could, you know, come from his lower middle class background into being, hey, a high court judge. And he said he was still almost confused. And he was saying it would have been such a wonderful opportunity for kind of young brothers who believed in education to go in there and really, you know, offer a good service. And I thought his response was kind of poignant and really interesting, and that he's still very much caught in an image of the experience he had as a young, bright boy who's encouraged to do, who has a great educational experience, coming from a family that wouldn't have had a lot of resources. So yeah, they, you know, what he failed to kind of really grasp was that they sent in a different kind of brother to Artane than they did to the school that he went to, and that they had an utterly different view of the boy who's trying to get the scholarship, and the boy who, through poverty, has been committed by a court to an industrial school. They really did have this belief that there were two different classes or types of person, not that there was the same potential to gain from education by both boys. So I think that kind of, you know, the pleasant or even inspiring, encouraging, fond experiences and memories we have as middle class people of our Catholic education, I think can really blind us to the ways in which they perpetuated a very, very vicious neo-colonial class hierarchy in the 20th century. And also there's a horrible, horrible knowledge, I think, for people who were educated, for example, by the Mercy, by the Christian Brothers. The money they made in those mass institutions where they incarcerated poor and working class children went into the institutions whereby they were trying to raise up lower middle class children. So the exploitation of one group fed into the opportunities that were granted other groups. We haven't quite acknowledged that yet.
No, I wasn't aware. As someone who was educated in a Sisters of Mercy convent school education for my secondary years, I wasn't aware of that at all, Catherine.
Yeah, it was the Mercy that ran the Galway Magdalen. And I mean, the amount of money, I mean, they were incredibly good businesswomen. That particular Magdalen served most of Connacht, commercial laundry of Connacht. So yeah, that money went right back into the Archbishop of Galway. Brown took quite a big chunk of it to build his cathedral. So he was continually putting the squeeze on them for money. We can see this in the diocesan archive, but they also had a huge amount that they could distribute to their other works.
I don't know whether you can speak about this, Catherine, and it's something that we have spoken about before in terms of your research into Donnybrook. One of the things that both myself and the artists were fascinated by were the accountancy ledgers and going through with the accountants in terms of just the sheer huge amount of money that they were bringing in from everything from, you know, RTE to St. Vincent's Hospital to the hotels in there. Can you speak a bit about that? I don't want to kind of break into, because I know that the book is coming out quite soon as well, but maybe if you wouldn't mind saying something about.
We expect the book will be out by December this year. So that's kind of soon for an academic book to go through all the processes it has to go through. So yeah, I mean, you know, we'll have a lot to reveal in the book around the money generated. I think it's just fair to say now is that we, for Donnybrook, we utterly put pay to the lie of the Magdalenes report that said the nuns didn't make any profit. These were, I mean, that never made sense to me anyway, because Donnybrook was sold as a commercial laundry to a capitalist in 1992 who went on to work that business for many, many years afterwards. Limerick was sold as a going commercial concern. How could these have been sold, successfully sold to commercial interests who went on to continue to make money out of them if they weren't indeed profitable? So yeah, so just to say, we will be revealing a lot of the very interesting detail on that in the book on Donnybrook when that comes out.
Well, we look forward to that, Catherine. Thank you so much. That was just brilliant, as always, just fantastic. Really great, and hopefully we will continue to work with you over the next year.
Oh yeah, and listen, congrats to Alice and Rachel. I got to visit the exhibition last week and I'm just so buzzed and blown away by it. So yeah, I've been telling everybody I've met about how incredible it is, and the Sinead Gleeson soundscape and response too is just extraordinary. So I'm looking forward to going back to Rua Red and sitting with it some more. And yeah, I have these. So I've been looking at.
Oh, great. That's great to see. Well, the map is open until the 12th of March. So there's a couple more days to go.
Oh dear, okay.
And I suppose the reason that we are doing this series is not only to celebrate International Women's Day, but also the closure of the map. This is the third talk within the series. So we have another 2 events to go. We have the Gathering of Voices, which will happen tomorrow night at 6:30. And if anybody wants to attend that, you're more than welcome. And then the end of the series is a lecture by Tara Lundy, and that's at 4 o'clock, and that's going to be online now on Saturday the 12th, and it's the Sacred and the Profane, Woman, Art and Nature. Again, massive thank you to you, Catherine, and also to our behind the scenes technical team. Thank you, Fran. You're just brilliant, and to Joyce and Hugh as well. And also just a quick mention to your funders, of course, because without their help, the series, the entire series, and the surrounding education programme would not happen. So South Dublin Arts Office, Creative Ireland, and the Arts Council. Thank you. Thanks everybody for attending today's event.